They started laughing before the stranger even reached the bar. That was the first mistake Dry Creek ever made with Silas Reed. The batwing doors swung open slow beneath the howl of desert wind, and every eye inside the saloon turned toward the tall man standing in the dust-colored light. His coat looked 20 years old. His boots were cracked from miles of hard ground. No revolver rested on his hip. No rifle crossed his back. Just one tired horse tied outside beneath the fading Arizona sun and a leather satchel hanging from his shoulder like it carried rocks instead of clothes. One of the ranch hands near the poker table smirked into his whiskey. Hell, he muttered loud enough for half the room to hear, either that old man's brave, or he's already dead. A few men chuckled into their drinks. Silas stepped forward without answering. The wooden floor groaned under his boots. Dust drifted off his coat sleeves every time he moved. He looked like a man who'd spent too many nights sleeping under cold stars and too many mornings riding toward places decent folk tried avoiding. The bartender narrowed his eyes. "We don't serve drifters without money." Silas finally lifted his gaze. Pale gray eyes. Calm eyes. The kind that had already seen worse things than mockery in a saloon. He reached into his coat pocket slowly and laid $2 silver onto the counter. The bartender stared at the coins but did not move. "Money spends anywhere," Silas said quietly. His voice sounded rough like dry leather dragged across wood. Before the bartender could answer, another cowboy stood up from beside the card table. Young. Loud. Half drunk already. "Hold on," the cowboy grinned. "Man walks in here looking like a graveyard undertaker and expects a warm welcome." More laughter filled the room. Somebody near the piano coughed into a laugh hard enough to spill his drink. Silas remained still. That silence only made them push harder. Men like that town feared silence more than threats. The cowboy stepped closer and nudged the leather satchel with his boot. "What's in the bag, old-timer?" "Rocks. Bible verses. Maybe you're selling miracles now." A few more laughs. Then the cowboy noticed something dark along Silas's sleeve. His grin faded slightly. "You bleeding?" Every eye dropped toward the stain running near Silas Reed's wrist. Old blood. Dried dark against the dust. The room quieted just enough for the piano player to stop moving entirely. Silas looked down once. "It ain't mine." The air changed after that. Small towns in the territory had a way of smelling fear before trouble arrived. Outside, wind pushed sand along the empty street. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell creaked softly in the evening breeze. The bartender finally reached for the whiskey bottle, but before he poured, something slipped from Silas's coat pocket and hit the wooden floor with a sharp metallic sound. A necklace. Apache beads wrapped around an old silver cavalry badge. And suddenly nobody in that saloon was laughing anymore. The silver badge spun once across the wooden floor before coming to rest beside Silas Reed's boot. Nobody moved. Nobody even reached for a drink. The only sound inside the saloon came from the ceiling fan turning slow through cigarette smoke and heat. One of the older ranchers near the window leaned forward first. "That cannot be real," he whispered. The young cowboy who had mocked Silas moments earlier bent down and picked up the badge before anyone stopped him. His smirk faded almost immediately. United States Cavalry. Weathered silver. Scratches deep enough to tell stories all by themselves. Wrapped around it were faded Apache beads stained dark from age and dust. "Where did you get this?" the cowboy asked quietly. Silas looked at him the same way a man looks at rain rolling across distant hills. Calm. Tired. Unmoved. From a grave. The cowboy laughed nervously and tossed the badge back onto the counter like it suddenly weighed too much. "You expect us to believe that?" Silas did not answer. The bartender finally poured the whiskey and slid the glass across the bar, though his hand no longer looked steady. Silas lifted the drink slowly but never took a sip. His eyes stayed fixed on the saloon mirror behind the bottles, watching reflections instead of faces. Outside, the evening wind carried dust through the empty street in long thin waves. Dry Creek always grew quieter before nightfall, but tonight the silence felt different. Heavy somehow. Like the town itself was listening for something far away. A man seated near the piano narrowed his eyes at Silas. "I seen Apache beads before," he muttered. "Usually hanging from raiders." Another voice answered from the card table. "Or dead soldiers." A few men chuckled, though weaker this time. Nobody seemed fully comfortable anymore. The bartender wiped the same glass 3 times before finally speaking. "What happened to your sleeve?" Silas glanced down at the dried blood near his wrist. "Buried a boy this morning." The room fell still again. "White boy?" someone asked from the back corner. Silas finally drank from the whiskey glass. One small sip. Then he set it down gently. "Apache." A chair scraped sharply across the floor. One ranch hand stood immediately. "You riding with them now?" Another muttered under his breath, knew something was wrong with him. But before the tension could climb any further, the batwing doors opened again. Sheriff Cole Mercer stepped inside carrying desert dust across his boots. Tall man. Gray mustache. Eyes that missed very little. Conversation stopped the second he entered. Cole removed his hat slowly and glanced around the room until his gaze landed on Silas Reed at the bar. For one brief second, the sheriff froze completely. Not fear. Recognition. Deep recognition. Like seeing a ghost he thought the desert had swallowed 20 years ago. Silas did not smile. Did not nod. The sheriff's eyes drifted downward toward the silver cavalry badge resting beside the whiskey glass. His face lost color immediately. One of the ranchers noticed it first. "Sheriff?" Cole swallowed once before answering. "Where did you get that badge?" Silas looked toward the dusty window beside the bar where fading sunlight bled across the street. "Man named Gray Hawk sent for me." The sheriff's jaw tightened hard enough to show beneath his beard. Somewhere outside town, a church bell rang once in the distance. Then came another sound beneath the wind. Horses. The sound of horses carried through Dry Creek like distant thunder rolling across open desert. Every man inside the saloon heard it. Nobody needed to speak. Sheriff Cole Mercer turned slowly toward the window, his weathered face tight beneath the brim of his hat. Outside, evening sunlight stretched long across the empty street, painting the town gold and blood red at the same time. Dust moved low along the ground in twisting waves. Silas Reed remained seated at the bar with one hand resting near the whiskey glass and the other beside the silver cavalry badge. Calm. Too calm for a man hearing riders approach after dark in Apache country. One ranch hand finally broke the silence. "How many?" Cole did not answer right away. He stepped toward the batwing doors and listened again. Hooves. More than a few. Steady. Organized. Not drunk cowboys returning from a cattle drive. These riders moved with purpose. The sheriff looked back over his shoulder toward Silas. "You brought them here?" Several men immediately stood from their chairs. The tension inside the room shifted like heat before a storm. Silas lifted his eyes slowly. No, his voice stayed low and even. They were already coming. That answer settled badly over the room. One of the younger men near the poker table cursed beneath his breath and reached for his coat hanging nearby. Another moved toward the rifle rack mounted against the far wall, but Sheriff Mercer raised a hand instantly. "Nobody touches a gun unless I say so." The order carried weight. The room obeyed, though reluctantly. Cole stepped closer to Silas now, studying him carefully beneath the hanging lantern light. "I heard stories about you 20 years ago," the sheriff said quietly. "Thought they died with the territory." Silas gave the faintest shake of his head. Most things out here do not die. They just stay buried. The bartender swallowed hard and glanced again toward the windows. Who is Grey Hawk? Silas looked into the whiskey instead of answering immediately. The amber liquid trembled slightly from the distant rhythm of approaching horses. A father, he said at last. A man who remembers debts. Nobody inside the saloon liked the sound of that. Especially not when paired with Apache riders arriving after sunset. Outside, townsfolk had already begun disappearing from the boardwalks. Windows closed one by one up and down the street. Curtains shifted. Dogs barked somewhere near the church before suddenly going silent. Dry Creek had seen trouble before, but fear moved differently when it came from the horizon instead of inside the town. Sheriff Mercer leaned both hands against the bar. You going to tell me why Grey Hawk sent for you now? Silas finally reached into the leather satchel beside him. Every man in the room stiffened slightly, but all he pulled out was a folded piece of cloth wrapped carefully in worn buckskin. He placed it on the counter with slow deliberate hands. Then he unfolded it. Inside rested a small pair of moccasins. Child-sized. Covered in desert dust. The bartender stared first. Then the sheriff. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Silas touched the tiny leather shoe with one rough finger. His son died 3 days ago crossing Blackstone Ridge. Even the loud young cowboy from earlier stayed quiet now. I buried him myself. Sheriff Mercer's eyes narrowed slightly. Why would an Apache chief trust a cavalryman to do that? Silas finally looked up. The lantern light caught the exhaustion in his face for the first time. Because once upon a time, he said softly, I carried his daughter out of a fire while my own men rode away. Outside, the horses suddenly stopped. When the horses stopped outside Dry Creek, the silence inside the saloon became heavier than fear itself. Nobody reached for a drink anymore. Nobody even breathed too loudly. Men who had spent their lives driving cattle through storms now stood frozen beside poker tables staring toward the street like schoolboys waiting for bad news. Sheriff Cole Mercer moved first. Slow. Careful. His hand rested near his holster, though he had not drawn the weapon. Not yet. Through the dusty front windows, shadows crossed the fading sunlight outside. Riders. More than 10 at least. Maybe 20. Hard to count through the blowing sand. Silas Reed stayed seated at the bar, his weathered fingers resting near the tiny moccasins folded inside the buckskin cloth. Calm as stone. The young cowboy who had mocked him. Earlier leaned closer to another ranch hand and whispered, You telling me that old man brought Apache warriors into town over a dead boy? Silas heard him anyway. No, he said quietly. They came because grief travels farther than revenge. Nobody answered that. Outside, saddle leather creaked softly beneath the desert wind. Horses shifted against wooden hitching posts. Then came the sound of boots on the boardwalk. Slow footsteps. Measured footsteps. Sheriff Mercer stepped toward the saloon doors just as a figure stopped outside beneath the lantern hanging over the entrance. The shape stood still behind the dusty glass for several long seconds. Small. Thin. Not a warrior. The doors finally opened, and a young Apache boy stepped inside carrying a wrapped bundle against his chest. Maybe 13 years old. Dust covered his moccasins nearly to the knees. His dark hair hung loose around tired eyes that had seen too much road for someone that age. Every man in the room stared at him. The boy ignored them all. His eyes found Silas immediately. Then he crossed the saloon floor in silence. Even the piano player lowered his gaze as the boy passed. Silas stood slowly from the bar for the first time since arriving in Dry Creek. The Apache boy stopped in front of him and held out the wrapped bundle with both hands. Grey Hawk says the mountain kept this safe, the boy said softly. His English carried the slow careful rhythm of someone choosing each word with respect. Silas accepted the bundle carefully. His rough hands paused for half a second against the cloth like he already feared what waited inside. The entire room watched him unwrap it beneath the lantern glow. Inside rested an old cavalry hat badge blackened by smoke and age. One edge had melted slightly from fire years ago. Sheriff Mercer's face tightened instantly the moment he saw it. "Dear God," he whispered under his breath. Silas stared at the badge without moving. Dust floated through the light between him and the sheriff like drifting ash. The Apache boy looked up at him carefully. "Gray Hawk remembers the river." Something inside Silas changed at those words. Not fear. Not anger. Something older. Sadder. He closed his hand slowly around the burned silver badge while memories seemed to move behind his pale eyes like shadows crossing old ground. One rancher finally muttered, "What river?" Sheriff Mercer answered before Silas could speak. His voice came low and strained. "Red Willow Crossing." The room stayed silent. Every man in Arizona Territory knew that name. 20 years earlier, an entire cavalry patrol had vanished there during a winter storm. Official reports blamed Apache raiders. But Cole Mercer had once ridden with soldiers who whispered different stories after too much whiskey and too little sleep. Stories about smoke. Screaming horses. And one cavalryman who turned against his own commanding officer. Outside the saloon, another horse stepped forward across the dirt street. Heavy. Slow. Important. The Apache boy looked toward the door. "Gray Hawk is here now." The saloon doors stayed open after the Apache boy spoke those words. "Gray Hawk is here now." Nobody inside Dry Creek moved for a long moment. The lanterns hanging from the ceiling swayed slightly in the evening draft while dust drifted through the doorway like smoke. Then the sound came again. One horse stepping slowly across the dirt street outside. Heavy hoofbeats. Patient hoofbeats. Not the nervous movement of frightened riders. This horse carried someone who feared nothing in that town. Sheriff Cole Mercer removed his hat slowly and lowered his eyes toward the floorboards for half a second before looking back up at Silas Reed. "You should have warned me," he said quietly. Silas rested the burned cavalry badge beside the whiskey glass. Would it have changed anything? Cole did not answer. Because both men already knew the truth. Dry Creek had spent years pretending old sin stayed buried beneath desert sand. But the desert never buried anything forever. The young cowboy near the poker table finally stepped backward toward the wall. His earlier arrogance had vanished completely now. "Sheriff," he whispered carefully, "how many riders are out there?" Cole walked toward the saloon window and glanced through the dusty glass. His jaw tightened. Enough. Outside, townspeople stood frozen along the boardwalks beneath fading sunset light. Nobody reached for weapons now. Even the loudest man in Dry Creek understood something important had arrived with the night. Silas turned toward the Apache boy standing quietly near the bar. "Did Gray Hawk come alone?" The boy shook his head once. "Many came." Several ranchers exchanged nervous looks immediately. One muttered a prayer beneath his breath. Another reached into his pocket and removed a silver cross hanging beneath his shirt. But the Apache boy continued calmly. "They did not come for war." Nobody seemed fully convinced. Silas studied the child carefully beneath the lantern glow. "Then why are they here?" The boy hesitated before answering. "Because Gray Hawk says debts should not die with grieving men." The room fell silent again. Sheriff Mercer slowly turned back toward Silas. "What exactly happened at Red Willow Crossing?" Silas stared toward the open doorway where cold desert air drifted into the saloon. For the first time since arriving in town, his shoulders looked heavier somehow. "Older. Bad orders," he said softly. "Proud men. Winter hunger. Fear." Cole nodded slowly like he already knew pieces of the story. And the fire? Silas closed his eyes briefly. Just briefly. There was a wagon carrying Apache families across the river. Women. Children. Snow had trapped them between the banks. The bartender stopped wiping glasses completely now. Every man listened. My commanding officer thought they were raiders hiding supplies. Silas rubbed his thumb slowly across the burned silver badge. He ordered the wagons burned before sunrise. Nobody spoke after that. Outside, the sky above Dry Creek darkened from orange into deep blue. One by one, lanterns began glowing across town windows. Sheriff Mercer finally asked the question nobody else wanted to ask. And you disobeyed? Silas looked up at him. I carried a little Apache girl through smoke while the rest of my unit rode away. The Apache boy near the bar lowered his eyes respectfully. That girl was Gray Hawk's daughter. The word settled heavily inside the saloon. Men who had mocked Silas only an hour earlier now avoided looking directly at him. The young cowboy swallowed hard before speaking. What happened to the cavalry officer who gave those orders? Silas stared into the darkness outside the doorway. The desert kept him. Before anyone could ask another question, a shadow crossed slowly past the saloon entrance. Tall. Broad-shouldered. Wrapped in dark buckskin beneath the lantern light. The Apache boy stepped aside immediately and lowered his head. Then a deep calm voice came from outside the doorway. Silas Reed. Every man inside the saloon turned toward the entrance as Gray Hawk finally appeared. Gray Hawk filled the saloon doorway without saying another word. The lantern light outside painted long shadows across his buckskin coat while desert wind moved slowly around him like the night itself had stopped to listen. He looked older than Silas remembered. Deep lines marked his face beneath streaks of gray hair tied behind his shoulders. But his eyes had not changed. Dark. Steady. The eyes of a man who had buried too many people and forgotten none of them. Nobody inside the saloon moved. Even the air felt still. Behind Gray Hawk, more Apache riders waited silently along the street beside their horses. Not one weapon raised. Not one angry shout. Just patient silence beneath the cooling Arizona sky. Sheriff Cole Mercer removed his hat completely now. A gesture of respect few men in Dry Creek had ever seen him offer. Gray Hawk stepped inside slowly, boots heavy against the wooden floorboards. The Apache boy moved aside immediately to let him pass. Every rancher in the room watched with the same uneasy expression men wore during funerals. Gray Hawk stopped only a few feet from Silas Reed. For several long seconds, neither man spoke. 20 years of memory stood between them like another person in the room. Finally Gray Hawk lowered his gaze toward the burned cavalry badge resting near the whiskey glass. You kept it, he said softly. Silas nodded once. So did you. Gray Hawk looked toward the small moccasins folded carefully beside the badge. Pain crossed his face for the first time. Quiet pain. The kind carried too long to show openly anymore. My grandson should have reached the winter camp before the storm, he said. The mountain decided otherwise. Silas lowered his eyes briefly. He was not alone when he died. Gray Hawk inhaled slowly through his nose, holding the words close like a father trying not to break apart in front of strangers. Then something unexpected happened. The Apache chief placed one hand over his chest and bowed his head towards Silas Reed. Respect. Deep respect. The entire saloon froze. Men who had mocked Silas only hours earlier now stared in complete disbelief as one of the most feared Apache leaders in the territory honored the quiet stranger standing beside the whiskey bar. The young cowboy near the poker table looked pale beneath the lantern light. Why? He whispered before he could stop himself. Gray Hawk turned toward him slowly. Because your town sees dust on a man's coat and thinks it knows his soul. Nobody answered. Grey Hawk's voice stayed calm, but every word carried weight heavier than anger. 20 winters ago, soldiers came to Red Willow Crossing while our children slept beside frozen wagons. Fire followed them. Sheriff Mercer lowered his eyes toward the floorboards. Grey Hawk continued. Most men obeyed bad orders that night. Then he looked back toward Silas. One did not. Silas remained silent beside the bar, his weathered hand resting lightly near the whiskey glass he barely touched. Grey Hawk studied him for another long moment before speaking again. My daughter still carries the blanket this man wrapped around her shoulders after pulling her from smoke and snow. A ranch hand near the wall finally muttered beneath his breath, "Dear God." Outside, Apache riders remained still beneath the night sky while lanterns flickered along the empty street. Nobody in Dry Creek seemed certain how to breathe anymore. Grey Hawk slowly reached inside his coat and removed a folded document wrapped carefully in leather. He placed it on the counter beside the burned cavalry badge. Sheriff Mercer frowned slightly. "What is that?" Grey Hawk answered without looking away from Silas. "A debt." Silas stared at the folded paper for several quiet seconds before touching it carefully with rough fingers. Then his tired gray eyes narrowed. Slightly for the first time all evening. Because he recognized the official government seal pressed into the leather. Silas Reed stared at the government seal pressed into the folded leather document while the entire saloon waited in silence around him. The lantern light flickered softly against the old paper as if even the flame understood something important was finally surfacing after 20 years buried beneath desert dust and regret. Grey Hawk stood across from him without moving, broad shoulders still beneath the buckskin coat, dark eyes steady as stone. Outside, Apache riders remained mounted along the empty street of Dry Creek while nervous townsfolk watched through cracked curtains and darkened windows. Nobody in town had expected the night to turn into this. Least of all the men who laughed when Silas first walked through those saloon doors. Sheriff Cole Mercer stepped closer to the counter. "What is it?" he asked quietly. Silas finally unfolded the leather wrapping with slow careful hands. Inside rested several aged papers tied together by faded string. Official military documents. Stamped with the seal of the United States Army. The sheriff's eyes narrowed immediately. "Where did you get those?" Grey Hawk answered first. "From a dying man." The room remained still enough to hear the ceiling fan turning overhead. Silas read silently for several long seconds. His weathered face revealed almost nothing at first. Then his jaw tightened slightly. Not anger. Something heavier. One ranch hand near the wall swallowed hard. "What does it say?" Silas looked up slowly toward Sheriff Mercer. "It says Red Willow Crossing was not an Apache attack." Nobody breathed. The sheriff removed his glasses carefully and rubbed one tired hand across his face. He already knew. Maybe not every detail. But enough. Silas continued reading from the papers in his hand. Captain Elias Turner ordered the wagons burned after mistaking refugees for raiders. The young cowboy near the poker table looked confused. But the army blamed the Apache for killing the patrol. Grey Hawk's voice cut through the room calm as winter wind. Because dead men cannot argue with written lies. Silence. Again. The bartender lowered his eyes toward the whiskey bottles behind the counter as though ashamed to stand in the same room as the truth. Silas carefully unfolded another page from the stack. His tired gray eyes moved slower this time. Then he stopped reading altogether. Sheriff Mercer noticed immediately. "What is it?" Silas did not answer right away. He stared at the paper like it carried the weight of every mile he had ridden since leaving the cavalry behind. Finally he spoke quietly. There was a witness statement. Grey Hawk lowered his head slightly. "My daughter gave it before she died last spring." Something inside the room changed after those words. The Apache girl Silas had carried from smoke and snow all those years ago had grown into a woman. And now she was gone too. Silas folded the paper carefully between rough fingers. I did not know. Grey Hawk nodded once. She told my grandson to find you before winter took her memory with it. The Apache boy standing nearby lowered his eyes respectfully toward the floorboards. Sheriff Mercer glanced between both men. So that is why you came to Dry Creek. Silas rested the documents gently beside the whiskey glass untouched for nearly an hour now. No, he said softly. I came because a boy died alone in the mountains carrying papers that should have reached me years ago. Outside, cold wind pushed dust through the street beneath the lanterns while Apache riders waited silently in the darkness. One ranch hand finally spoke with a shaky voice. What happens now? Grey Hawk turned slowly toward the frightened men inside the saloon. Nothing. Confusion crossed several faces immediately. Grey Hawk continued calmly. No revenge came with us tonight. Then his eyes settled once more on Silas Reed. Only truth. The sheriff looked down at the old military papers resting on the counter. 20 years of lies sitting beside one untouched whiskey glass. Then from somewhere outside the saloon came the sound of church bells ringing across Dry Creek. The church bells continued ringing across Dry Creek long after the sound should have faded. Slow heavy bells rolling through the cold desert night while nobody inside. The saloon seemed capable of speaking anymore. Silas Reed stood quietly at the bar with 20 years of truth resting beneath his weathered hands. The military papers remained spread beside the untouched whiskey glass and burned cavalry badge like ghosts finally stepping into lantern light after hiding too long in darkness. Sheriff Cole Mercer stared down at the documents with tired eyes. If these papers are real, he said carefully, then the army buried innocent people to protect a dead officer's name. Grey Hawk looked toward the sheriff without anger. White men have buried many truths in this land. Nobody challenged him. Because nobody could. Outside, Apache riders waited silently beneath the stars while Dry Creek watched from behind shuttered windows and half-open curtains. The town that had laughed at Silas Reed now sat frozen beneath the weight of what stood inside that saloon. The young cowboy who mocked him first lowered his eyes toward the floorboards. Why come here tonight? He asked softly. Why not take those papers straight to the governor? Silas looked toward him for the first time in several minutes. The old cowboy's face carried exhaustion deeper than age itself. Because truth means nothing if nobody is willing to look at it first. The room stayed quiet after that. Even the bartender stopped pretending to clean glasses now. Grey Hawk slowly stepped beside Silas at the counter and rested one rough hand near the folded papers. My daughter waited many winters hoping the world would remember what happened at Red Willow Crossing, he said. Before she died, she told my grandson that one honest man still carried the memory. Silas lowered his head slightly. Not pride. Regret. The Apache chief continued speaking while the lanterns flickered softly overhead. The boy who died in the mountains carried these papers through snow because he believed old truths should not freeze beside old bones. Sheriff Mercer inhaled deeply through his nose and looked toward Silas. You knew those documents existed? Silas shook his head once. I thought they burned with the wagons. The sheriff picked up one of the pages carefully beneath the lantern glow. There are signatures here from military witnesses. His eyes narrowed slightly as he read farther down. And recommendations for your arrest. One ranch hand near the poker table frowned in confusion. Arrest? For what? Cole looked up slowly. For disobeying direct orders during wartime. Silence again. But this silence felt different now. Not fearful. Ashamed. The young cowboy swallowed hard. So the army blamed you for saving people. Silas gave the faintest nod. Army needed a villain more than it needed truth. Outside, cold wind drifted through the open saloon doors carrying dust across the wooden floor. Grey Hawk glanced toward the dark street where Apache riders waited beneath lantern glow and moonlight. My people remember differently, he said quietly. We remember the soldier who carried a child through smoke while others rode away. The bartender finally stepped forward from behind the counter holding the whiskey bottle in trembling hands. This time he poured Silas a fresh glass without being asked. No hesitation. No suspicion. Just respect. He slid the drink across the bar slowly. I judged you wrong, he said under his breath. Silas looked at the whiskey for several long seconds before lifting the glass. But instead of drinking, he turned and placed it gently in front of Grey Hawk. The Apache chief studied him carefully. Then for the first time that night, the corner of his mouth moved slightly. Not quite a smile. Something older than that. Something earned. Outside, one of the Apache riders began singing softly beneath the desert stars. A low morning song carried by cold wine through the empty streets of Dry Creek. And inside the saloon, men who once laughed at the quiet stranger suddenly understood they had spent the entire evening standing beside a man far braver than any of them. The Apache morning song drifted through Dry Creek long after midnight settled across the desert. Soft voices carried by cold wind beneath a sky crowded with stars. Inside the saloon, nobody touched the poker cards anymore. Nobody laughed. The same men who mocked Silas Reed hours earlier now stood in silence around the old cavalryman like they were afraid sudden movement might disturb something sacred resting in the room beside them. The whiskey glass remained untouched in front of Grey Hawk while the military papers sat open beneath lantern light for all of Dry Creek to see. Truth finally had witnesses now. Sheriff Cole Mercer folded the last document carefully and placed it back onto the counter with slow deliberate hands. His face looked older than it had at sunset. This changes everything, he said quietly. Silas leaned one shoulder against the bar, exhaustion settling deep into his bones after the long ride through mountains and memory. No, he answered softly. It only changes what people are finally willing to admit. Outside, Apache riders began dismounting beside the church and water troughs. No threats. No raised voices. Just tired men stepping down from saddles after days crossing winter roads. Dry Creek watched from behind curtains while fear slowly gave way to confusion. Grey Hawk looked toward the open saloon doors where cold air drifted across the floorboards. My people will leave before sunrise, he said. Sheriff Mercer nodded once. You are welcome to stay the night. Grey Hawk gave the faintest shake of his head. The desert remembers us better than towns do. Nobody argued with that either. The young cowboy who had mocked Silas first finally stepped away from the wall and approached the counter carefully. His boots sounded too loud in the quiet room. He stopped a few feet from Silas and lowered his eyes. Mr. Reed, he said awkwardly, I judged you wrong. Silas studied the young man for a moment beneath the lantern glow. Then he looked toward the faded cavalry badge resting beside the whiskey glass. Most men do when they only look at dust. The cowboy swallowed hard and nodded slowly. No excuses followed. None were needed. The bartender reached beneath the counter and pulled out a clean bottle wrapped in cloth. Better whiskey than before. He placed it carefully in front of Silas. For the road, he said quietly. Silas looked at the bottle but did not touch it. Instead he picked up the burned cavalry badge one final time. His thumb brushed slowly across the melted silver edge blackened by smoke from another lifetime. You know, Sheriff Mercer said after a while, if these papers reach the governor, your name could finally be cleared. Silas stared out toward the dark desert beyond the street. Wind moved gently through the town carrying dust beneath moonlight. Maybe. Cole frowned slightly. That does not matter to you. Silas took a long breath before answering. The people who mattered already knew the truth. Grey Hawk lowered his head once beside him. Respect passed silently between the two old men while the saloon lanterns flickered low. Somewhere outside, a horse snorted softly beside the hitching rail. Dawn still sat hours away, but the longest part of the night had finally passed. Silas carefully folded the military papers and handed them to Sheriff Mercer. "Send them east," he said. "Let the dead rest honest for once." The sheriff accepted the documents slowly like they weighed more than paper ever should. Grey Hawk moved toward the doorway then paused beside Silas one final time. "My daughter once said the fire at Red Willow Crossing took many things from this world," he said quietly. "But it failed to take your honor." Silas lowered his eyes toward the wooden floorboards for a long moment. Then the old cowboy finally picked up the whiskey glass and took one small sip beneath the fading lantern light. Outside, the desert wind carried